Okay, good morning and welcome to our latest webinar on behalf of the employment team at DMH Stallard. My name is Greg Burgess. I'm one of the partners in the team, and I'm joined by Adam Williams, another partner in the team. We have a two-part series, starting with the first part today on the new working world. And I'll talk to you in a short while about what's going to be covered today. And I'll also then talk to you about what's going to be covered in the second session, which is in a few weeks' time. Just some housekeeping first, if I may. We will aim to be running the session for an hour, which will comprise about 50 minutes, maybe 55 minutes of talking with questions at the end. With your questions submitted during the course of the webinar, if you can put them in the Q&A function in the webinar system. If you have technical problems, if you can use the chat function, and our team here will seek to answer those questions and deal with any technical issues as well. But yeah, for questions that you want Adam or I to answer, please use the Q&A function. We will try and answer as many questions as we can. Our commitment, though, is to make sure that we're done within the hour. As is normal for you who have used our webinars before, what we always commit to do is to produce a Q&A document as well as a full recording of the webinar, which is then put on our website, and that will be next week. So if your question isn't answered today, please rest assured that we will answer it, and it will be published on our website next week. Okay, so today we are covering the following. As I say, this is a two-parter. So the first part today, we have Adam, who's going to talk to you about vaccinations and all of the issues that are arising in relation to the vaccination rollout. We're then going to spend the main part of the session, if you like, on home working, and that will cover a broad range of topics, including what you need to be doing in terms of updating contracts of employment clauses you need to be looking at, issues such as planning and insurance arising from working at home, employee monitoring. We're seeing a lot in the press about employee monitoring. We're going to cover that today, and a little bit on data security and data protection. And then Adam's going to wrap up with some thoughts around overseas employment for those lucky, perhaps, employees of yours who are sitting on their verandas in Barbados, enjoying working from there. So I'm going to hand over to Adam, and I will be back with you in a short while.
Thanks very much, Greg. Hello, everybody. So I'm going to talk about vaccinations today. Obviously, it's a developing subject area. An interesting one in that we don't have established legal framework or any precedent in relation to the specific issues that arise around vaccinations for COVID in the workplace and employers' approach to them. So we're going to do a couple of polls just to get your answers on a couple of things. First one is, have you introduced a COVID vaccination policy in your workplace? So that's specifically for COVID vaccinations. I'll give you 20 seconds or so to answer that. Okay, so 90% have said no, 3% are unsure, 6% yes. So a hugely overwhelming number of people saying they haven't. That's not really a surprise for the reasons I'll come on to about how there's a lot of variables in this at the moment. And of course, we're not at a stage where the vast majority of people are back at work yet. You know, in a lot of settings, people are still working from home under government recommendations. Next one, have you asked or will you be asking your staff to tell you whether they've been vaccinated? Again, I'll give 20 seconds or so. Okay, it's come through. Much more of a split this. 30% think they have or will be asking staff to say whether they've been vaccinated. 38% no, 32% unsure. So a real mix, which is always good for us to debate issues like that in the session today. So that's great. I'm sure you'll all be aware that it's a complex area, this, given that it touches on medical status, personal health. So there's special categories of data. There's the fact that you might be trying to impose somebody to have a medical intervention and vaccination. But that doesn't seem to have stopped people thinking it's potentially a good idea. I had a quick look at some stats, and HR Locker had conducted a survey in January showing that 23%, its stats suggested, of employers plan to make vaccinations mandatory, and that nearly half of recruiters had said they would prioritise vaccinated applicants during recruitment, which is a very interesting stat, raises a number of questions, I think. And nearly 60% of managers polled by the Chartered Management Institute in March of last year, 2020, so this is just as the pandemic and lockdown was hitting, believe that vaccination should be mandatory. Now, that view may have changed over time, but it indicates there's certainly a relatively large grouping of people that think it's a good idea. There's also HR software being developed and launched to help employers monitor vaccines. So is it really a good idea? And I guess most importantly for people watching today, is it a good idea for your organisation? Well, there's some key issues that we're going to look at today. Can you impose mandatory vaccination? Is that something you can do? Can we dismiss fairly an employee who refuses to be vaccinated? And might our vaccination policies or requirements, if we introduce them, amount to unlawful discrimination? There's also issues around human rights and data protection as well. So before we look at those in a bit more detail, let's think about some of the variables here that make this a difficult issue for employers to grapple with and come to a firm and certainly lasting position on right now. So if you're dealing with this issue or think about it internally and scratching your heads a bit, that seems to me to be entirely understandable. We've got lots of variables. The rollout and uptake of vaccines means the landscape's constantly shifting. The number and age range of adults who are vaccinated is changing all the time. And that, for reasons we'll see, has a bearing on the issues we're looking at today. What about legislation? Well, we don't have a legislative basis to require vaccinations, even at government level. And there's consultation on this. The position may develop over time, but it's not fixed yet, and it's certainly moving. So that's another variable. We've got new variants. So lots of variants and variables here, but new variants are popping up all the time. And we don't yet know what the need for boosters or new vaccinations might be and how frequently that might arise. That's clearly going to be very relevant to the question of how employers approach vaccination. You've got COVID status certification and testing that may develop in as well, so that, the position changes dramatically to one where many people take up COVID status certification, can just demonstrate vaccination. It becomes a bit of a non-issue, who knows? And regular testing, which is clearly a very now very available, twice weekly availability from the government of lateral flow testing, alternative means of trying to manage COVID risk in the workplace. That has all got to sort of flesh out. And a key one, I think, that we'll come back to is whether the vaccine reduces transmission or does it simply suppress symptoms in a carrier. The stats and the government information we put out talks a lot about breaking the link between infection and hospitalization, but that only goes to the one of those 2 points. And currently, we're not in a clear scientific place about the benefit, if any, of the vaccine on reducing transmission. And I think that informs a lot of the basis on which an employer might be looking to justify requiring vaccination. And I think that means that we are in a very, very shifting landscape at the moment. It's difficult to be clear on an appropriate position to place ourselves. So that's the key variables. Let's think then about that first issue of mandatory vaccinations. Now, there's ACAS guidance on this. There's also a CIPD guidance note online, which I think is useful to read if you haven't yet, that talks about the issue of vaccinations. Do you require them? And interestingly, I think this was influenced by the ECHR and other commentators in February time discussing the issues and problems with requiring vaccination. But the ACAS guidance up until mid-February had been saying it may be appropriate to require vaccination in certain circumstances, and indeed might even be justified to discipline or dismiss someone for not taking the vaccination when required. That was removed in mid-February. And ACAS guidance now says, just to pick a quote out, it's best to support staff to get the vaccine without forcing them to. So a softer position from ACAS in the current online guidance. The Prime Minister gave a slightly different position on it, and this is in late March, to the House of Commons Liaison Committee, saying it would be wholly responsible for care home companies to think of requiring vaccinations. But what we can see there is that that comment is made in a specific context rather of care home companies. And I think, again, that's another issue where the workplace setting and the health and safety risks to workers, customers, service users is likely to be influential as the law develops in this area on the extent to which vaccination can lawfully be made a condition of employment. And at the moment, just picking up another couple of points there, in the absence of new laws, which we don't have yet, if you force an employee to be vaccinated, it'll be an offence. It's effectively an assault or battery on the person. So we clearly can't force vaccinations on people in that way. We had consultation launched earlier this month on making vaccinations compulsory for those working in older adult care home settings. So that is relevant and goes to the point of the context in which it might be seen as justified to require it. That's in consultation phase though. So we don't have, even if you're in that setting and sector, the clear legal justification for requiring vaccination yet. So very many issues there around mandatory vaccinations that would need to be worked through. Now, the issue with requiring vaccinations it goes further than that, in that it's untested in Great Britain. We don't have any examples of an employer requiring it and that being tested in the courts yet. Even at the government level, there seems to be talk around shifts in that in relation to the NHS and there being a requirement to be vaccinated. But at present, that's around encouraging of vaccination and professional ethics and duties of doctors and surgeons to be vaccinated to protect themselves, and a lot of focus there on the need for vaccination because we need to reduce sickness absence in the health service, etc. The other point is it's not suitable for everyone, vaccination. So if you've got immunodeficiency or medication that suppresses your immune system, it might be that you shouldn't have a vaccination, that people with long COVID possibly. And there's that complex position about pregnant women as well, and what should the position be on that. It could be indirectly discriminatory and requiring objective justification as well. So if you have a policy as an employer of requiring vaccinations, that will be a provision criterion or practice that you're applying to either all of your staff or a group of staff. And if it then puts people at a disadvantage who share a protected characteristic, it will be unlawful indirect discrimination under the Equality Act unless you can objectively justify it. Now that justification raises two issues, one being you need a legitimate aim, and the other being proportionality in your means of achieving it. And this could arise in the context of age, where at present, this is where my point around the landscape is shifting, this may change over the next few months, but at present there's whole swathes of age groups who actually just physically can't get a vaccine and would be at disadvantage compared to older age group. Could be race if there's a difference in vaccine take-up in ethnic groups. Could be philosophical belief, although my own view from case law in different contexts, but around the issue of cogency, worthy of respect in a democratic society, I question whether anti-vax beliefs would qualify as a protected philosophical belief, but it's not yet tested. And you can think of the cases around ethical veganism to know that is a developing area in itself. So we'd have to wait and see. And disability, if a disability is the reason why you feel you can't be vaccinated, clearly that might give rise to an issue. So there's an issue there. Legitimate aim may not be difficult here. Health and safety would be the obvious one, and we'll come on to that and why that is should be in most cases a quite straightforward legitimate aim. So that's your aim. But what about proportionality? The focus there will be on whether other alternative means would achieve your aim, i.e. protecting health and safety and complying with your duties as an employer in that regard, but have a less negative impact on the protected group. And again, we'll come on to that shortly as well. Human rights is an issue. I'll touch on this briefly. Again, we don't have any law to talk about in terms of a really reliable precedent for the COVID vaccine yet. There's an ECHR case earlier this year relating to the Czech Republic, looked at the issue of Article 8, private and family life, and Article 9, rights to freedom of thought and religion, case called Vavrika and others. That related to compulsory child vaccination programs where there were penalties, financial fines for non-compliance. And the ECHR said it's not a violation of human rights. So something of an encouragement there, but it is fact specific. The applicants have said that it was a breach of their rights because children weren't able to go to preschool unless they'd been vaccinated. The judges said 16-1 in favour, so a big majority said they're necessary in a democratic society, these measures to require vaccination. Objective is every child is protected against serious disease through the virtue of herd immunity. And the means through which it was done, fines that were at a certain level, limited level, and just it being preschool environment where children wouldn't be able to go if they weren't vaccinated meant it was a proportionate policy. But the key point there is, I think, that it's of limited value because it's relating to established diseases, the science around them is developed, and just one example of a distinction is that herd immunity point is very clearly accepted in the context of things like MMR and other vaccinations that were dealt with here. So human rights is not an issue that's just solved by that case by any means, and there could be challenges around it. There's also negative press. The first employers that take a hard stance on this to require it and indeed dismiss people who don't have the vaccine would have a high risk of being subject to negative press. And of course, even if you don't force someone to resign, but the manner in which you force someone to be vaccinated, but the manner in which you present the requirement is taken offence to, you might end up with employees saying you've breached their implied trust and confidence terms or others, and they resign and look at constructive dismissal. So lots of issues there to work through, and legal issues we've just described that you'd have to think through and make sure you feel confident your organisation can answer and counter. Health and safety briefly. The duty is for all employers, implied and common law, to provide a safe working environment. So that's for the person you may be seeking to encourage vaccination for, and for their colleagues. So there's a clear, solid basis to say we've got an aim here and a duty that we need to follow, and that vaccination may form a part of it. And the question is, to what part and to what degree is it mandatory? You've got the statutory duties under health and safety legislation as well to take steps to assess risk and identify them. So if you wish to impose a mandatory vaccination requirement, then you should first be undertaking detailed risk assessments about why the vaccination is required, in addition to the stringent COVID secure guidelines, which should already be in place. Why is it needed in addition to be mandated? And consult with workplace representatives or trade unions, depending on it precisely which risk, health and safety type of risk you're focusing on. So then let's look at, we talked about alternatives, and this goes back to that point I mentioned about objective justification. If you get groups saying, well, I can't get vaccinated because of my age, for example, and this is discriminating against me, what are the alternatives? Well, there are other measures to increase voluntary uptake. And I suspect that the bulk of employers, if they're looking at vaccination, will go somewhere down this route, certainly for the initial period, rather than mandating vaccination, where you're informing and encouraging staff to look at the vaccination and take it up. Think about your approach to the winter flu vaccination. Policies on vaccination, good idea to consult with staff on that, and having a communication strategy. So you're not forcing people to vaccinate, but you're trying to encourage the take-up. Look at the COVID-19 secure measures. Do you need anything more than them to manage risk? Are they all in place? Do you look at regular testing? We talked about flow testing and COVID certification that might come in, and health and safety reviews. How does that come into the mix as an alternative? And segmented approach. Maybe you've got particular areas of your business where you assess risk through your health and safety process and say there's a particular risk to them or clients or service users in that area of our business where we think we should say that vaccination is required. So just moving forward. And how does that all feed into this final point about disciplinary and dismissal? Well, those with 2 years service have the right not to be unfairly dismissed. You might, if you go through the process and decide you want to require vaccination, find you get rejections and refusal of that. In theory, you could be saying that was a reasonable management instruction, and it's the reasonableness that will be tested as against the points we just described about what is the health and safety aims, is mandatory vaccination necessary for it, and is there reasonable cause for refusal from the individual. But you need to think about, what is the risk assessment? Do we have a powerful case to say it's reasonable to require you to have this vaccination and dismiss you if you don't? What are your reasons? If they're legitimate, and certainly if they're protected, you're going to need to think very long and hard about whether dismissal is going to be within the range of reasonable responses. Is there a legitimate particular health and safety risk of vaccination for this individual, which means it wouldn't be fair to dismiss them? Do they have protected reasons why they shouldn't be vaccinated, or could challenge you if you require them to, for example, because they're in an age group, racial group, etc. And what are the other reasonable means? The problem we have as employers is on the face of it, there are lots of other reasonable means to manage this health and safety risk, which we just looked at. And clearly you'd have the exposure to a challenge from an employee that there was other ways to achieve this that didn't need me to be vaccinated, and therefore, well, how could it have been fair to dismiss me? So lots for you to take away and think through there in terms of that. Data protection, just quickly, it's special category data, immunisation records. So yes, you could in theory legitimately ask and try to keep a record of who's vaccinated, but you need a lawful basis. You'll need that under Article 6 in terms of basis, and condition for processing under Article 9. Employee consent you could rely on, but remember, consent can be withdrawn and then you don't have a basis anymore. So legitimate business interest may be the one that you end up looking at more closely. And then in terms of your condition for processing, well, perhaps rights and obligations in connection with employment, or you look at purely health purposes. But remember, under health purposes alone, you will still need compelling reasons, but you will also need to have a health practitioner who's taking additional steps to explain what they do with data, like you would in the OH context. And think about retention. If everybody gets vaccinated, can you still keep this data? Does it need to be deleted? And your privacy notices might need to be updated. Some points there to take away on vaccination policies. Consulting is helpful. How do you intend to communicate the policy? Have you updated data protection obligations and privacy notices? And can you use it to reduce risk of workplace conflict around means of resolving any fallings out in the workplace? Look at the purpose and benefits, position of you as an employer on key issues, and cases where it's not appropriate, make sure you cover those, and the importance of other measures. And I will hand back to Greg now to look at changing and updating contracts given the new home working world.
Thanks, Adam. Questions are coming in thick and fast, so thank you for those, and please do keep them coming in. To be fair to Adam, what we'll do is I'll carry on with my section and keep dropping your questions into the Q&A, and then we'll make time at the end to pick out some of the questions and answer those in that final 10 minutes leading up to 11 o'clock. As I said, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat function for your questions. Okay, so while Adam thinks about the answers to some of the questions that have been posed, I'm going to look at the issues around the contract of employment. So we've been grappling with the new working world for the last 12 months. And of course, going forward, we're going to start planning for what your working environment is going to look like in terms of remote working, hybrid models, and so on and so forth. What I'm going to look at now is things you might think about in terms of your contract of employment, which you may be reviewing or you may be having to review in the coming weeks and months to reflect what your working world is going to look like. So first area you will be looking at inevitably would be the place of work clause. Hopefully you've got flexibility in that clause already. You may say that the normal place of work is the office at X, but we reserve the right to change that on a temporary or permanent basis, or words to that effect. That may give you some element of flexibility, but the clause for the hybrid model may look quite different, or a clause where you are just having home working, again, would look slightly different. The key from your perspective inevitably is to make sure that you've got that flexibility in there. So as you start planning and implementing your working models going forward, make sure that we have the flexibility in your place of work clause in your employment contracts. And of course, you'll want to have the flexibility to require them to attend offices, meetings, client events, disciplinary or consultation meetings, and so on. Key there, make sure you've got your flexibility. Benefits. Some benefits are conditional on them being in the office and at the place of work. So the obvious ones might be, you might have a gym on site, you might have a canteen. Well, what are you going to do in relation to the loss of those benefits if they're working from home? And it may be that you need to look at compensating them for the loss of that benefit, or of course you can offset that with perhaps another benefit that will be in their favour. So it's a balancing act. We've had lots of thoughts and questions over the last 12 months about expenses and what you have to pay for. Can they, or will they be able to, in the new world, claim travel expenses if they attend the office, if their normal place of work is home? The sense we get from our employer clients is that the hybrid model will probably be the most commonly used model, but exactly what that looks like in businesses will vary from business to business. And just to be clear, the new working models that we'll be talking about will be covered in the second session in May, and I'll give you more details of that at the end of this session. In terms of expenses, if they're visiting customers and suppliers, is that going to be expensed in terms of travel? You will have formed a view on telephone, broadband, heating and lighting costs over the course of the last 12 months. Many businesses seem to be saying, well, some of those costs the individual will absorb, given that they are saving in terms of the commuting costs, in most cases, by not going into the office. And then there's equipment being provided as well, which needs to be factored in. Again, in most employers we're dealing with, the extra equipment costs will be picked up by the employer, but not in every single case. It depends on what equipment we're talking about. Okay, other clauses that you will be looking at as you redraft your employment contracts, thinking about reporting procedures for illness and whether that needs to be adapted. Do you want to retain the explicit right to cut off their IT access if they're off sick and working at home? Definitely something that we've seen as the stress levels of working at home have increased during the course of the last 12 months. Some employees genuinely find it difficult to switch off that laptop, to close it down and to not look at the emails. Those are the ones that are perhaps suffering from stress or anxiety, and you want potentially to retain the express right to say that if you're signed off sick, we may remove your access. And if you have that express right in a contract or even in a policy, then that will stand you in good stead to do exactly that. Something which I haven't seen raised as an issue, but certainly something you would be thinking about in your new contracts, if you are allowing home working to various extents, is to retain the right to enter their home. You might need to install, maintain or service their equipment. You may need to help them or to actually risk assess their working environment, or on termination to recover your property. You need to have an express right to do that, and it would be in the employment contract that I would expect to see that. Very common and very advisable to make sure that any new working arrangements are put in place on a trial basis, allowing both parties to genuinely test the effectiveness of the arrangement and make sure you keep it under review. We've had this in place under the flexible working rules, where often where there's a flexible working request, if it is provisionally accepted, then I always say to clients, put it in place for 3 or 6 months and make sure it's monitored, because if you don't do that, it becomes a permanent change straight away. And that's something that if it's a permanent change, you then may have some difficulties if it's not working out. So during the trial period, you make it clear that it's not a permanent change to their terms and conditions. Okay, hours of work. Well, big question. What will normal working hours be? Do they need any at all? Is it core hours going to be in your business between 10 and 4? They'll be expected to be online or whatever it might be. Some employers are genuinely taking a very flexible approach and empowering their staff and trusting their staff to effectively choose their hours. And particularly in the last 12 months, where many individuals have been juggling so many other pressures at home, the attitude and approach to what our normal working hours has changed significantly, and I think will need to continue to change significantly. I've dealt with a query this last week where CFO of a £30 million business wants to reduce his days from 5 to 4. He'll work extended days on those 4 days, allowing his wife, who's returning from maternity leave, to set up her business. And the CEO is saying, well, absolutely, that's exactly what we would be prepared to allow, because we fully trust him to deliver. He will be available in emergencies on the 5th day. And it comes down to that aspect of trust and about outputs. And that's where we see the whole focus changing, is that employers we see taking the view that we trust people to do their work as long as the outputs are there. Exactly over what hours they do it, to some extent, is a matter for them. Now, of course, that's maybe slightly idealistic. There's a balance to be struck, but these are definitely considerations that we are seeing employers work their way through, and of course that will then need to feed into contracts of employment. And you've got to make sure, just a reminder in terms of rest breaks, very important as we are working from home, is to make sure that as an absolute minimum, you've got the working time rest breaks, but you're reminding staff, and this is all on the HSE website, about getting up, moving around, taking breaks from the screen because of your obligations in terms of their health and safety. Okay, so just moving away from the employment contracts for a second, a couple of other points that come up occasionally. We've had the question over the last 12 months about planning permission. Do you need to talk to your staff about planning permission for them to work from home? Pretty infrequent, but there is a possibility that if they are making structural changes to their home to facilitate home working, then it could be that they need to seek planning permission for those structural changes. It's a question of degree. It depends on exactly what's happening in their home working environment. But if, for example, they were having visitors, business visitors coming to their home or to their property, then that's moving more in the direction of a requirement for planning permission. Now, most of us are working from home. We might be working from a home office if we're lucky, or from a room. Well, that doesn't bring planning into play at all. But if it's more substantial than that in terms of the home working environment, then it may be that's an issue. Insurance, have you checked your employer's liability insurance to make sure that all the equipment in the home that you've provided is covered under your employer's liability insurance? If it's not, have you required your staff to make sure it's covered on their home insurance? And if that is a cost that they are going to add to their premium, then it would be reasonable, I would suggest, that the employer covers that additional premium. Okay, employee monitoring. Well, we've had quite a lot in the press, certainly in sort of late summer of last year. It was around employee monitoring for employees working at home. And there's lots of pre-pandemic cases which looked at the tension between the right to privacy and family life and the employer's right to covertly monitor staff. The direction of travel, generally speaking, was that employers can usually sustain a right to covertly monitor staff, and that usually takes precedence over the right to private family life. But in the UK, we do have some very clear guidelines through the Data Protection Act and through what's called REPA, which is the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, which do limit an employer's power to monitor private communications. And these both sets of legislation have been in for many years, as many of you will know. And we also have the Code of Practice from the Information Commissioner, which requires you to carry out an impact assessment if you're going to be doing any form of covert monitoring of staff. There you go, Guardian headline, September last year, shirking from home, staff feel the heat as bosses ramp up remote surveillance. And this was in the context of press reports of PwC producing software that was going to develop facial recognition tools to allow them and their clients to, with financial institutions, to monitor traders' activities as they sat there in front of their screen. It received a lot of adverse press, but what PwC was saying is that in a trading environment, it is a requirement under sort of regulatory rules to make sure that you have full visibility of the activities of the traders. So there was some commercial justification there. And we've seen talk of various tracking tools, real-time activity tracking, taking screenshots on a periodic basis, keystroke logging. I think it was Barclays who were in the press for having software which was monitoring keystrokes to see how active people were at various times of the day, and even webcam surveillance. So there's lots of reports around there being an increase in demand for these sorts of software tools and these monitoring tools. Personally, I haven't seen any clients come to me and ask for advice in relation to the legitimacy of them. I'm not saying for a second that you can't look at these things. The key is to make sure that you are as transparent as you can be with your staff about what you're doing and why you're doing it. So entirely covert use of these things, I think would be very difficult to justify. What you should do if you're looking at these things is to risk assess fully and then to talk to your staff about what monitoring will take place and why. And the general approach should be, well, less is best in terms of what monitoring you do. And then just finally in my section, just looking at data security and data protection issues arising from remote working. Well, there are, of course, particular challenges in respect to data security and the movement of data now from the office into the home environment. How will it be stored? It's moving in and out of home. Document creation and retention and disruption. Well, this is certainly something that we've struggled with in our business, because by nature of what we do, we have highly confidential documents, and we are very, very careful to make sure that those documents don't leave the office unless it's absolutely essential that they do. So we do try to avoid printing documents and moving them between sites. But these are issues that you need to be thinking about, because if people are moving personal data between locations, or they're printing stuff out, the question, of course, arises is what are you doing to make sure that they're not retaining those documents, that personal data, for any longer than is necessary. And some thoughts around actions you may need to take given the increased risk of data breaches. You need to consider whether the data will be accessed and processed at home. Do they really need all the data they got access to? Not necessarily. It may be that you need to look carefully at what you now give them access to, or will be giving them access to going forward. Remember that you as the employer will still be the controller or processor of that personal data. And if it's accessed by the employee at home, what technical and organisational measures do you have in place? And do you need to put in place any additional measures? Have you looked at your data protection policy? And does it need updating to reflect the additional expectations or considerations arising from working from home? And the same for privacy notices. You should all have an employee privacy notice as well as your data protection policy. And the employee privacy notice should reflect what uses may be made of personal data. And teeing Adam up for his next session about employees working abroad, and certainly data protection is a key consideration for that, because if they are working abroad, then almost by necessity personal data is being transferred from the UK out of the UK, and you need to think about the cross-border data transfer issues. It can happen, but it needs to make sure that you are reflecting that in your data protection assessments. Okay, so with that in mind, we're at 10:40, so 10 minutes, Adam's just going to run through some considerations around overseas employment, and then we'll do our best to get through as many questions as we can.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, we've got lots of questions. I've had a look at those, Greg. The questions coming through on vaccination, some really interesting ones. We'll come back to that at the end. Quick couple of polls then for overseas working. Have you had UK-based employees working abroad during the pandemic? And by that we mean where they wouldn't normally be. Yes, no, or unsure.
I found out about a month ago that one of our partners had spent the last 11 months in New Zealand working from there. So it's not uncommon during the last 12 months.
Mixed split here. 45 yes, 45% said yes, 52 no, 3% unsure. So at least half and half, and there could be examples of cases where you haven't been aware for most of the time, or aren't yet aware that people are sitting at home, but actually it's abroad. So a good even split there. Do you envisage some of these employees, of the half who say they know they've got people abroad, continuing to work abroad in the longer term, asking you to make it more permanent or indeed permanent? Yes, no, unsure. We're certainly seeing a lot of that in terms of the when I look in my team, the immigration issues around this, clients coming saying they're getting requests. So yeah, a good nearly 30% of people in the session saying yes, they do envisage people saying they want to continue doing that in the longer term. About half saying no. So certainly scope for that to come up. So let's just look at this quickly. As Greg said, going to spend about 10 minutes looking through. Context is we've had large numbers of migrant employees, i.e. those that aren't living or based in the UK originally, returning to their country of origin, or it could be another country actually that they were just visiting and got stuck in during the pandemic, and then couldn't get back to the UK and have just stayed there working remotely outside of the UK. And to a large degree, it may be that didn't have any discernible or obvious impact. They're sitting at a laptop in the same way that any of your workers in the UK have been sitting at a laptop. So it's actually not always easy to spot this. And some employers won't have known that's the case. Others, they may have been aware and made a conscious decision to agree to it, either for a long term or short term. Many of these arrangements may last beyond the current pandemic, though, which is a point we've just identified in the poll. And you may well be getting or get requests from employees who feel that the situation actually works quite well for them. In a similar way, you may be getting requests over time for more working from home from UK-based staff to say, I quite like this, and can we make it permanent, please? So that's the context. I think, seems to be a live issue for most people on the session today. I thought I'd do an example scenario. That's mainly because this is such a fact-specific area, mainly based around where is the person and what is their own immigration status, payment position, where are they being paid and from where, etc. That this is the best way, I think, to give an idea of the things you should be thinking about. So I've got David here, recruited and employed by a UK bank to work full-time in the UK. He's got family in France, so he was in France visiting them when lockdown happened. Travel restrictions prevented him from returning to the UK, and so he stayed there, working remotely for the bank. No changes have been made to the contract. Nothing's been done about that, and he's continued to be paid from UK payroll as he was before. And that's a pretty common scenario, I would say. Certainly in my experience, I suspect it's quite common generally. So let's look at the issues then. One of the issues to touch on is immigration. Now, if David is a French national, the position in France should be quite straightforward. French national should automatically have the right to live and work in France unless they've given up that nationality. Makes things straightforward. If he's not, local advice is needed with regard to his immigration status and options. Is he lawfully working there? Can he lawfully work for the bank there? There may well be things that need to be done to regularize that, given limitations around what you can do as a visitor. Different EU member states have different rules on that. If David's a British national and he returned to France before the 30th of December 2020, perhaps his family's got a wife there, he's returned there, and essentially has gone back and ended up staying there to live, can he benefit from the French equivalent of the UK's EU settlement scheme, i.e. he was resident before the end of the Brexit implementation and transition phase? Who knows? If he's not British or Irish, what impact is his absence having on his right to return to the UK to live and work? He might benefit from the EU settlement scheme, or he might require new or updated visa sponsorship under the 2021, the new points-based system. Now, if the bank already sponsors him, and that would most likely be because he's a non-European national under the UK's points-based system, it will need to ensure that the contact details of him are up to date on the sponsorship management system for the Home Office, and that any change of circumstances have been reported as required. And is David's ability to subsequently settle in the UK impacted by his absence? One way or another, whether it's under EU settlement or one of the points-based system visas, you need to have a certain number of years qualifying residence, and his absence may actually undermine his ability to get settlement, or indeed how soon he might be able to apply for it. So lots of immigration issues to think about. Tax, there are unlikely to be no tax implications. David's been spending several months working abroad. We don't provide tax advice, but we work closely with tax advisors, and my expectation would be there will be some form of tax issues to work through here. So local advice would be needed about the extent to which David might have become tax resident in France, and that might mean income tax withholdings, obligations there. If it doesn't already have one, the company needs local advice about whether the situation inadvertently creates a permanent tax presence and reporting obligations for the bank in France. That could be very significant in monetary terms for tax implications for the company. And is there a double taxation scenario here with David? And if so, what's the relief position? Can you get relief? How should it be claimed? Payroll as a linked issue, and social security. So it seems unlikely in this case the bank has an existing payroll arrangement in France, or that it's been making social security contributions for David there. And often the default position in my experience anecdotally is that in this sort of scenario where the originating employment is in the UK, the bank would start by continuing to pay NIC's contributions in UK payroll. But advice needs to be taken on how and when they might be obliged to make social security contributions in France. When has that arisen, or will it arise? And if a withholding obligation has arisen in France for this, the bank needs to work out what the payroll arrangement needs to be to facilitate that. And do they need to look at pan-European arrangements and certification to be used in relation to contributions, like the old A1 certificates that we use to ensure that the social security doesn't double up and is paid in a way that balances out the two jurisdictions. So lots of complexity. Again, that would be tax advice you'd be taking on that. Quickly, corporate and regulatory issues can arise. The bank needs to check whether it has or requires any registrations for David to carry out the activities on its behalf in France. His role might be regulated itself. So does he have all necessary approvals and permissions? Are they present and correct for that activity? And if he's a director, can he still attend board meetings in the UK? Is there something in the articles that prevents that to think about? There's other issues as well around pension, insurance benefits to think through as well. But on the employment rights point, which is obviously one of the main focuses that we would come to this issue from as a team, even if he's worked there for a short period, it's possible David benefits from employment rights under French law. The bank needs to take local advice on that position and what the risks and obligations are from it. For example, does it create an issue on termination? He might still benefit from employment rights in the UK, even at the same time. And the test there would be, does he still have a greater connection with UK employment law from the perspective of the UK courts and tribunals? So he could end up benefiting from two sets of employment law rights is the key point, regardless of what his contract says. And if he went to the location before the end of the transition period, New Year's Eve, there's also the posted worker directive that the bank needs to think about in terms of minimum employment rights that must be honoured in the country that's hosting him at the moment. So lots to cover there, and that's a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully it's got you all thinking about your own example scenarios and whether you're fully up to speed on all of those issues.
Okay, thanks, Adam. So what I think we'll do, Adam, if I pick out the questions that I'll answer in relation to the section that I did, and while I'm doing that, if you want to think about the questions on vaccines,
we'll
come on to that. Okay, so first question, I'm not necessarily able to do all of them, but I'll do what best I can. Question is it the suggestion that if we move to hybrid that we need to change contracts and make it explicit? Therefore, should we be changing 5,000 contracts? I don't think we need to go through a process to change 5,000 contracts. I think what you will be doing is you will be engaging with staff about the proposed, let's say, hybrid working policy, and that's what I expect to see. For new starters, you would have perhaps a different version of the place of work clause in the contract, but for existing staff, you can keep it as it is. But the whole point is that through the policy that you'll be introducing and any ancillary letters that you might send to confirm the new working arrangements moving to the hybrid model, that will set out the variation to the employment contract. That's not to say that you can't update your contract and include that. It may be that you're reviewing your contracts anyway, and of course, if you are, then you might include a new sort of hybrid working clause in the place of work part of the contract. Not dissimilar question, but I'll read it out from Kate. Do you actually need to change the contract to implement hybrid working? We are thinking of approaching by trialing a new policy covering all of this. Yes, I agree with that. Not changing the base. So if it doesn't work, either for the individual or for the business, we'll be able to say your place of work remains the head office. Well, if you go to your staff and you're consulting over the proposal to trial a new working arrangement, you would do it very much on the basis that it's a trial. You would have retain the right to revert to a different arrangement. And so as long as you can show the evidence of the discussions and the way it was presented to staff, then I have no problem with you not changing the contracts for now and relying on the paperwork and the policies about the trial of the new working arrangement. Question around compressed hours and holiday. If you compress hours 5 days into 4, does that impact annual leave prorated to a 4-day working week? I think the answer must be no. They're still a full-time employee. My example of CFO, it was in a business who's going to be working his full-time hours over 4 days, but he's still a full-time employee and would be entitled to holiday, the same holiday as any other full-time employee. If we receive a high number of flexible working requests, what's the quickest way to process these? Yeah, well, certainly I think many employers are starting to get a lot of informal flexible working requests. I guess the business, depends on your business and how big you are and how many you're getting. But if you take the initiative and you're leading these discussions around the new flexible working arrangements or hybrid models or home working models, then you will be positioning it on the basis that, you know, this is our plan for our business. There'll be variations within the plan, and if you are wanting to discuss a variation, then speak to your manager. That's a sort of informal approach to dealing with it. I guess what you will want to try and avoid is having to deem them to be formal flexible working requests, because that requires a meeting, that requires an explanation if you're going to say no to that request under the statutory rules, the inability to reorganise work amongst existing staff, impact on performance, etc. So I think the message I would give is you position it yourself by taking control of the discussion. You try and deal with things on an informal basis, but ultimately the statutory right to request flexible working is still there. So it may be that you do have to consider a formal flexible working request in that way. Adam, I'm going to shift over to you, conscious of time, and then we'll see how we go at the end if we've got any time for any more after Adam's done.
Good. Okay, thanks, Greg. Yeah, some interesting questions around vaccination. A couple have come through on overseas as well, so I'll try and pick up at least one of those ones that just come through right now. So I won't full names, but initials. So BK, you asked, can you request an employee undertake regular COVID tests if they refuse to have the vaccine? Well, I think any requirement to have an employee test themselves or take and report on their own health, you could get resistance clearly. But yeah, you could request it. And although I think there's obviously some risk of challenge, it should be harder by comparison to being required to vaccinate for an employee to legitimately push back on that. You just need to think about whether there is a very unusual reason and legitimate reason for refusal, like a mental health issue, philosophical belief that's protected, which makes you think about legitimate aim and objective justification around indirect discrimination. But by comparison, yes, you can ask, and it should, I think, as a very general proposition, be easier to show reasonableness there and harder for the employee to legitimately push back on in most cases. SW, what about staff, support staff and contractors who work within hospitals? Can they be forced to take the vaccine? Well, there's still definitely a risk of challenge on that. And you could become the losing test case, clearly, and get negative press if you have to take action to force it through or dismiss. But having said that, I think if you focus in very closely on health and safety risk assessments and are very clear and cogent about the vaccination being reasonably necessary to manage risks, either to them or to the service users they're with and come into contact with, you might succeed. The hospital context should also be one where there's more scope for this than for example, if you were an employer with a retail set of clothing retail outlets staffed by and frequented by young people. So it's a big question mark, but you have a slightly better context in which to explore that than some others, some other employers certainly. Quick one, RP, if international travel is required for a role and vaccines are required for travel, would that be a justification to require employees to have a vaccine? Well, it's a potential justification, but I think there's still some very key specific factual issues there. How necessary and fundamental to the role is the international travel? What are the other means of achieving your objective here, which I think in reality isn't strictly health and safety. There's a requirement to have the vaccine, but your objective as a business is presumably to have staff able to conduct business meetings and work abroad. Does it have to be in person? If they can show that there's other means of conducting business in the short term, and that they say, can we just see out the rest of the global vaccination program for the next couple of months, maybe that creates a concern for us that we might be seen as unreasonable in forcing it. And what about testing? Lots of countries are saying, have a vaccine certificate or be tested. That's how they are saying they might approach it. So maybe they can just say, well, I'll just get tested instead. So again, it's really important to think through exactly what's driving this for you and the position of the individual, whether they can say it's not reasonable to require it for me. HB, could you require new employees to get vaccinated, even if you just only encourage, I guess is what you mean, existing staff? Would it make a difference if all other employees had voluntarily been vaccinated? Well, I'll just pick up the first point, because I think the voluntarily vaccinated does make a difference in terms of the risk within the workplace, I suppose. But about requiring new employees but not existing, it's still a legal risk for the reasons we've discussed, but it's less so than mandating it for existing employees, because there's no risk of unfair dismissal claims from new recruits. They don't have the service, but you've still got the discrimination issues. So you'd need to think about those and all the other negative press and other issues we talked about today. Issues, Greg, I'll do one more vaccination one, can I? And then one overseas.
Yeah.
Issues with issues with employers requesting staff not to discourage others from getting the vaccine. Are there any issues? I think done in the right way, there shouldn't be. And in fact, it could be good ER risk management, actually, if it's managed correctly, in that this is a sensitive subject. You could easily find that there are employee relations issues and fallings out happening around this hot topic. It's a bit like, in a very different way, a bit like Brexit, isn't it? And Remainers and Leavers, and that concern that things could boil over within the workplace. Vaccination is not appropriate for everyone, so employees need to be sensitive about the dialogue they have. And I think you also need to think about being even-handed and saying, at the same vein, we shouldn't have staff encouraging vaccination for the same reasons. People might actually not be appropriate for vaccination. So lots to think about on that. And quick one on overseas then. So we've had two requests. This is AM. We've had two requests to permanently work abroad, but we don't want to allow this. Can we recall them? I think potentially yes, but if you require it and they refuse, then you're heading towards dismissal territory, aren't you? So think about, do they have service? Are they going to run an unfair dismissal claim in the UK, or indeed they're going to try and do it in the country where they are now? And how confident can you be of being able to defend that? In the UK context, that will be around the extent to which employees can justify its refusal. Why are they saying no? And on your side, the extent to which you can demonstrate that your decision was in the range of reasonable responses. And that's going to go to, why do we need you back? So possible, yes, but just those that hopefully that's a guide to some of the thought processes to work through on that. There's some really good questions there.
Okay, thanks, Adam. And we've tried desperately to get through as many as we can. We haven't managed to get through all of them. We've been asked whether we're going to be sharing the slides. So if you want a copy of the slides, Adam and my email addresses are on that final slide you'll see there. But as I said at the start, what we do is we will put on our website a full recording of the webinar, which will include the slides as well. And we'll do the Q&A as well as part of that. We've had over 190 people sign up for this, which is our highest in the 12 months we've been doing webinars. Our next webinar, which again is building on these discussions, is on the 20th of May. And this is the second session of the New Working World, looking in more detail at the flexible working models that we've touched upon today, looking at the impacts on employee engagement, what you need to be thinking about in terms of the change to your culture, to your company values. What about managing performance, enhancing productivity, all these sorts of things, slightly softer issues perhaps, which we'll be covering on the 20th of May. So look out for your invites from our team here for that. For those that have joined today, thank you very much. It's been a good session, some great questions. Apologies if we haven't answered your question, but we'll try and do so next week. For now, thank you and have a good day. Thank you.